Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making the Rounds. Sorry for the lack of content in the past couple days and the fact that this is coming out rushed. We had some unforeseen technical difficulties. Do not
Thank
have
you,
the
Spectrum
amazing
Internet.
production value of the Riot
We
Studio,
had video clips
unfortunately.
and everything. I'm so
But
mad. Anyway.
we're uh, we're basically terrible people. Anyway, point is that we have a really exciting last day to cover. I don't know, this was a really fun tournament for me to watch in general. I liked it from the perspective of a League of Legends fan, even if the game quality wasn't like insanely high level all the time. It was just there were good things, there were bad things. There were just like a lot of really cool storylines that you could see unfolding, and so I think it's fair that we at least make an effort to do this group stage justice. I mean, almost every MSI group stage has been really fun. I like this tournament a lot. It's there's so much back and forth in general, and I think this is why people like best of ones. So, what are your thoughts on MSI in general, Emily?
Yeah, it's a really volatile tournament. And it's kind of a Spartan tournament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you lose like one game and suddenly that matters so much more. It's the first year there was only a one round robin, which is like actually insane. So you only played, I think, a total of 5 games.
Yep.
So at least now it's a double round robin, but it still doesn't take away from the fact that like every single game pretty much
Mm-hmm.
matters. And I think we definitely saw that. We obviously saw that when it came down to what some of the things we saw from the Flash Wolves kind of waning in the lingering moments of the tournament, and then Team Liquid kind of improving a bit towards the end of the tournament. So it's just really volatile, and also I think the current meta for the tournament. I'm not going to say anything about the upcoming meta because I have a lot of capital O opinions on that, but
Mm-hmm.
the current tournament meta is actually really versatile.
Yep.
So we've seen teams picking a few different types of team compositions to set up different ways that they might want to play. And even if they're not executing them like as cleanly as maybe we would like, I still think that it's been a really good tournament to see a lot of different looks from different teams. So that's also really cool because whenever you have a tournament like this where it is super punishing if you lose a game and it's super rewarding if you win a game, and then on top of it to have a fairly flexible meta, it makes for a really fun and entertaining group stage, especially when you can see again how teams want to play going in, even if they might not necessarily execute it properly.
It's also just felt like a while since it seemed like pocket picks were like a relevant thing, or you can't give X
Mm-hmm.
person Y champion or something like this. And there have been multiple different instances where this MSI has kind of been able to showcase that, partly due to the versatility of the meta, and partly due to just so many people having vastly different interpretations of how it should be played effectively. So I think that that's been really cool that there have been specific target bans. It's almost antiquated that you say that someone's draft is bad based on them giving up X champion to Y player or whatever. But there have been a
Yeah.
couple of cases where I've been borderline like maybe, you know. So it's been pretty fun for that. From that perspective, though, I do think it's fair to say that the Day 5 storyline was really about Team Liquid. Like, obviously, there was a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of stuff going on. It was really cool to see RNG surge into first place because their first couple days, you would not have seen that coming, quite frankly. So it was also really cool to see UZI just like so happy. This guy, like, he wins LPL and the sea is parting and everything is just magical. He's walking on clouds, you know? But I do feel like Team Liquid were a really, really huge story on the last day because it was looking like, you know, they suddenly had everything fall off in their hands. So I wanted to say something that I actually thought was good about things that Team Liquid were doing on the last day, and one was just like they had a really good grasp on what to do with mid priority suddenly. And by that I mean like laning phase backing, because this was something that they have struggled with, I felt, all spring. Like this was a constant complaint from me against Pobelter that I had all spring, was just that like he constantly gives up lane priority or he's not really using it fully. But in this case it was just, okay, if I get the first back because Maple is invading enemy jungle, and so I get a little bit of push on mid when I shouldn't be getting push in this matchup, I'm going to really make it count, because I'm going to get the first back, I'm going to come back first, so I'm going to get push again because Maple has to match my back, and then I'm going to go bot really fast. And so this was like kind of an issue with Flash Wolves, where they leave their bot lane exposed to these types of setups and these types of situations. So I thought that that was like a really positive thing that we saw from Team Liquid's transformation, and they themselves on Twitter said stuff like, you know, we have finally figured out how we're supposed to play this, but it was too little too late, you know? So,
yeah, I thought, so one thing going into this tournament that I do think the Flash Wolves have improved at, but that I think they still struggle with sometimes, and we saw it in their match against Team Liquid as well. While Team Liquid was really able to punish a lot of their back timings, Flash Wolves sometimes do not know how to set up for their lead and transition their early leads into mid and late game leads and closing out the game. And that's something that this team has historically struggled with. And I think we, again, saw it in the Team Liquid game, and props to Team Liquid for being able to recognize that and punish that, because there was a time where all Flash Wolves are doing is like pushing their waves into TL, right? And they don't really have
more specifically.
They don't really have a good handle on like what they should do next. And TL, I think, did recognize how the game was stagnating and really took advantage of that. So props to them. That was really good.
Yeah, I think it was just, like, for me, the Flash Wolves versus TL game was obviously probably the highlight for Team Liquid on the last day. And I think that actually Flash Wolves had a relatively decent setup for pushing out waves and collapsing. As the game progressed, it became difficult for them, especially since TL have like so much disengage, which is really strong, but they just never put themselves in a position where they could use that, because whenever they got priority on the wave, they slow pushed it, which gave Team Liquid so much time to set up the collapse mid, to set up the team fights, to set up whatever they wanted to play out. And I liked the Gragas Janna comps. It's like one of my favorite things when mage supports are in meta, or Gragas Janna comp. Strong side lane push, you know. Love that shit. It obviously Gragas has a few issues with jungle matchups and things like that, but it's cool to see them play. Obviously, you see some of the bad things of Team Liquid still exist. Like, I think in the RNG series, it was the Fnatic tiebreaker, where Vlad just wasn't inside at all. Obviously, theoretically, Vlad ends up winning that matchup, but they got super ahead on Gangplank. They ended up punishing Vladimir a lot, but he just never tried to catch up. He never tried to get side lane push, really, and he was just mid way too often. So I think that there are still like a lot of issues that Team Liquid are working on. But in general, I think that their story is a good one to end the tournament on. Thoughts?
I mean, I think that a lot of people, when they see the standings, are just going to be like, wow, NA still sucks. And yes, North America has a lot of like macro problems that you actually should be paying attention to, because it's not like a lot of Team Liquid struggles at this event outside of Ollie's issue were super predictable. Like, they were predictable, you know? Like, this isn't new.
The mistakes were basically what we called out prior to the tournament.
Yeah. So I think that is something that people should address. But I also do think that Fnatic, Team Liquid, to some extent, I would still say RNG, but I don't know, I'm pretty harsh on RNG. Like, those three teams are a lot closer to each other than people would think based on this group stage, I would say.
And so maybe a little bit worrying when Fnatic are playing with a top laner that they haven't played with most of the season.
Yeah.
But hey, they did play with Bwipo for a long time in playoffs. maybe that's not like the perfect criticism.
Yeah. So I think that is another thing to take away from this. It's not like they did have a bad first 2 days, and I'm not trying to take away from that, and I'm not saying like, wow, we should be super proud of Team Liquid either, but I do think that the overreaction of like, you know, like NA is down here and everyone else is up here, like that's a little specious, I would say, because I think all of those 3 teams are a lot closer than people would like to admit.
My issue with NA isn't that I think the gap between NA and the other major regions is so significant. My issue with NA is that they're consistently just a little.
Yep.
That's the consistency.
And I would agree with that.
The consistency is more the problem than the gigantic gap itself, you know? Like, there are a few things that I think that they just maybe have a mental block about, or that they're thinking about in the wrong way. And you can have discussions with these people. They're self-aware of these kinds of situations, but they think things are played a certain way, and maybe if they have gotten punished enough, they'll change their perspective on them, or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see Team Liquid, if Team Liquid kind of change some of their fundamentals in the summer split. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and they have the tools to, and they also, to some extent, like the final game aside, because I don't think they knew how to use Vladimir very well, but like they do, like we said, they do tend to draft these 1-3-1 comps anyway. So then it's just really about execution, right, and how to spread pressure on the map. So, well, good luck, TL.
I also just want to shout out EVOS. Like, I think a lot of people sort of expected them to have nowhere near the presence of Gigabyte Marines, and I still think that it's fair to kind of say that, but I think that they ended up actually improving more over the course of the event than we saw Gigabyte Marines last year. They looked like they were pushing up and looking to get wins late in the latter stages of the tournament, whereas I felt like Gigabyte Marines kind of got figured out and people got used to them, you know? So there was a slight difference in how these teams evolved throughout the tournament, and it's promising to see that, okay, maybe the Vietnamese region just does have multiple, like, good teams a step above the other wildcard outside of just, like, almost the fluke YG appearance at Worlds.
Oh, no.
Gigabyte Marine, so that was a fun time.
YG, no. I remember those games. Yeah, I think the difference is that EVOS learned a lot more over the course of the tournament, whereas I think Gigabyte Marines came in with a higher level of understanding how they wanted to play and just the general macro game when they came into MSI last year, but they didn't learn as much or improve as much over time. Part of that could have been due to the fact that obviously, like, Stark was, I think, 2 months into his professional League of Legends career, so there's only so much you can do. But if you look at him back then and you look at him now, a year later, it's actually insane how much he's improved. And the team itself they seem very smart and eager to learn. And you saw them learning throughout the tournament, which is always really cool to see.
I'm not going to flame some of the weirder players, but I'm glad that Stark really stood out and looked really strong, and I think that that's very promising for him and very promising for the region as a whole, that it's not just like people making comparisons about Vietnamese junglers, or because I remember watching GPL and always thinking that like the Vietnamese teams had strong top, and so I actually do think that they have some good top, well, if it is a little bit behind. Okay. So that's basically covering the unlucky shit. I thought it would be fun when we get into semifinal predictions to, instead of making it, oh, who do you think will win? It's just one of us will predict one of the series, and the other person has to argue the opposite, that the opposite team will win. So let's go ahead and start off with the Flash Wolves Kingzone games.
All right. So I'm going to say Kingzone is going to win.
Okay, so I will have to argue the Flash Wolves proposition, but go ahead.
Yeah. I think that when you get into a best of 5, we have seen historically, a lot of players on this team are a bit, how to put this lightly, disrespectful, I suppose, in the regular season. And I think once they do get into a best of 5, they are adaptable. We can see them react a lot more, even in best of 3s, but primarily in best of 5s. The only one that you could take away from them would be the Samsung series last year, where they did not have Peanut, but it was pretty much the same team with Cuz, and they did get caught off guard. But I do think, despite some of their hangups in this group stage, I think that they are a more well-rounded team. Although I don't really want to see Khan play Vladimir again. And I think that they should be able to adjust, because what I've seen from the Flash Wolves, especially in the latter half of their group stage, is that they do still somewhat struggle if they do have a deficit. And also if they have, once they get to a mid-game point where they might not be able to recognize how to transition their advantages. And I actually think that is where a team like Kingzone will take advantage of those openings and opportunities, because we've already seen them do that in this group stage, despite the fact that it was quite shaky for them, like compared to expectations. So I guess that's my groundwork for it. I still think that the bot side priority is super important, so that's where we're going to be looking at. And I also am curious to see which jungler they start, because I do feel like that will also factor into how BDD plays for the team. And if Cuz is in the game, I think BDD, they'll look more from BDD. But if Peanut's in the game, they'll look to try to invade with him. And I actually think that could also possibly trip up the Flash Wolves early game, depending on what Kingzone decides to bring and how they adjust to these level 1s. And again, a lot of it is based on how I've seen them adapt over the course of this past split in reaction to teams, and how I saw them adapt in the final series. But yeah, I do think that they'll be able to recognize and punish the Flash Wolves' mid-game mistakes, even if they do end up with early deficits.
So the reason why I think Flash Wolves have been beating Kingzone is because Kingzone's read on how they're setting up their draft is, in my opinion, really poor for this. By that I mean they are a team that really likes prioritizing early bot picks and then counterpicking for their solo lanes, and that's something that they've kept fairly consistent throughout the event. And they're early prioritizing certain bot matchups that don't necessarily win, and that's why Flash Wolves are consistently able to get the bot push and the bot control that really makes their team. So from my perspective, I think that's why Flash Wolves have such a good matchup against Kingzone, is because they're really just not adapting that aspect of their game plan and that aspect of their setup to take into account that as well. I think the more abusive part of Flash Wolves, which is what we mentioned earlier, is when they make topside plays. Like, say they have multiple pushing lanes, if they're making a topside play, their bot lane is often open to a side trade, and if their bot lane is open to a side trade, then it's really easy to like over snowball bot from there. So if there's something like that, then I can see Kingzone do it in it. However, it was against Kingzone in the final game that they played before the RNG set, where I actually saw Flash Wolves make corrections to that kind of setup. Of course, they screwed it up again against RNG, but they made corrections to this kind of setup, and part of that was just that Maple, between every side invade, Maple was pushing out mid. So the wave was never resetting, and Kingzone almost never had priority in that situation. And also when they made hard topside plays, like when Maple just ulted top, their bot lane actually pushed out and backed so that they couldn't get collapsed upon. So I think that if Flash Wolves are able to get the kinds of drafts that they like against Kingzone, which Kingzone haven't shown any signs that they're changing their mind about how they want to do this, I still think it's like pretty Flash Wolves favored, actually, even in a best of 5 scenario. Especially because Flash Wolves have the higher seed, they will get side selection. And we see that like Flash Wolves are able to consistently get support counterpick on red side. So if it's a 5-game series, they have side selection 3 games, and they pick red side those 3 games. I think Flash Wolves can actually just win it. So for me, I haven't seen signs. Like, I really hate predicting for, yeah, but they could be really good at a best of 5. The best of 5 sample size that we've seen as spectators of Kingzone or Longzhu or whatever else is actually really narrow.
Yeah, it's 3.
We've seen them play as Longzhu. They've been in finals. As this Kingzone team, they've been in finals. They were they were in the quarterfinal of Worlds, and that did not go well. I think that their Peanut is not really has not been the best of 5 player that's been really consistent. So if they do put Peanut in, I'm not like 100% sure he's going to be the resilient best of 5 type player that people like usually associate with players on SKT or something like this. So for me, it's just kind of odd that they're given Kingzone are given the same like best of 5 faith as a team like SKT used to get, when I just don't think that they have earned it. So
that's fair. I think for drafting, I think what we'll see from them is a lot more less of what we saw against Flash Wolves, to be quite honest, because I don't think they're going to set up a draft, and I could be completely wrong about this, but I don't think they're going to set up a draft with a jungler that gets generally pushed on with a more carry type champion, like carry type split push champion for BDD in the Galsarum. I think what we're going to see is a lot more of something like, obviously I don't think
they basically had all losing lanes against Flash Wolves when they picked Yasuo.
Yeah. Which was
just at least early on. I mean, technically the bot matchup is a little bit weird because John probably doesn't get pushed like early levels and it's mostly on Ashe, and it basically came down to the fact that they matched supports and Invade, and Ashe got like huge priority in the lane and stacked like 2 waves, and then it was over. But yeah, I think it's anyway. Please continue. Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh no, I was gonna say, I think what we're going to see a lot more of is stuff like, and I mean, Flash Wolves can definitely prepare for this, but I think what we're going to see is more compositions like the one they showed previously that day with the Galio for BDD or something similar, where he has a lot more mid priority, and he also has the ability to get to side lanes like a Talia as well, something that they've been super successful with, and his ability to affect side lanes. And then Cuz played this game, but I actually did like the Camille jungle pick with the Galio and also with the Gangplank. I thought that was a really good combination, and I know people have called, I forget who it was, but people have called Kingzone like dirty side lane abusers for some of the compositions that they like to run. But I do think that is a lot more what you're going to see. That's a lot more standard Kingzone coming into this best of 5, and I think that should give them, even if they do fall behind early, a little bit more control over the mid and late game. And I'm honestly still not convinced in Flash Wolves. A part of it, honestly, is that the Flash Wolves, even though they adjusted the last day, I'm still not super convinced in their mid to late game, despite the fact that I will be the first person to admit that it's improved like significantly. And that's really where, in my opinion, they've overperformed, right? Because we expected them to have really strong bot side control. We expected that kind of vision net to come out, but we did not expect them to be able to transfer those advantages mid or top like they've been doing and then snowball the game from there. And I'm still not super sold on their ability to do that across a best of 5, because if you're also talking about historically in best of 5s, the Flash Wolves have been really bad internationally in them. And their first win was against Gambit, I believe, at this tournament. So their first international like best of 5 win.
Well, they also played the play-in best of 5 last MSI as well, right?
Oh yeah, right. So those two. And that is not a good.
And it depends on whether or not you count the IEM World Championship against our G2.
Yeah, G2.
Where they had the grand final. But yeah, it's
so it's
still like a small sample size, just like Kingzone. So
yeah, it's a similarly small sample size. So I think that is another thing to take into consideration, is that I really haven't seen, and like you can make the same argument for Kingzone, right? But I really haven't seen Flash Wolves also have to adjust and adapt in a similar way across a best of 5, because a lot of the best of 5s that they usually play in their region are sometimes quite one-sided, like their most recent finals. So I think that is another thing to take into consideration, just since you brought up the part about Kingzone, which I think is totally fair, right? Like, this is a team, like, you can point to Peanut and say, hey, you have struggled in best of 5s with SKT, with the Tigers, with some of these players you're playing with now. And then, so he is not like the shining answer to like solving their best of 5 problems. But I also think that you can look at the Flash Wolves and say similarly, where they have historically struggled in like Riot run international best of 5s when they're not in the play-in stage. So yeah, it should actually be really interesting to see which of these teams adapts faster over the series, because that's really what it's going to come down to. And I think it's going to be closer than people expect, but I still think that Kingzone should be able to do it.
It's just weird because it's in the composition, the draft you mentioned against FNC, they had to like heavily pinch the bot lane pool to get a favorable bot lane match. Like they ended up banning 2 supports, 2 ADs, and then Fnatic also opted into a ton of bot lane bans. And then they didn't even counterpick support, right? They still blinded the support, and Fnatic were forced onto something like that. So you're still in a situation in that case where I think that it could actually be really Flash Wolves favored if they don't opt into the same kind of like bot lane support ban off. Anyway, that's probably enough about Kingzone Flash Wolves. I think it'll be a fun game. I think both teams are actually showing mid-game macro issues. Surprisingly, Kingzone opting for these like really weird bot lane focused trades with Baron up and in groups. On is really out of sync with the team. Like a lot of stuff is just very odd. Where meanwhile, Flash Wolves are not controlling. They're slow pushing sides and giving enemy teams too much agency. Their Baron setups are hit or miss. Like it's gonna be, neither of these teams are what you would expect from teams that are considered significantly better than Fnatic and or something like this. But anyway. Moving on to the next series, RNG Fnatic, which is fairly spicy. Since you picked Kingzone for this one, I'm going to pick RNG. So I think that RNG wins this series, which means you have to argue the Fnatic perspective, so I hope you're prepared. But I think that the reason why RNG are winning this series is because Fnatic have a very, very limited pool of strategies that they're able to bring to the team. And a lot of that a lot of people are focusing on Reckless's champion pool, but I think it has a lot more to do with how fixated they are on Braum. And if they don't have an opportunity to pick something like Rakan, they're going for Braum very, very heavily. Braum gets pushed in by a ton of the support matchups that are viable right now. So RNG's weaknesses really come through when they, kind of like Flash Wolves, when they aren't getting the strong bot side 2v2, because they aren't going to lane swap even if their top has priority. So like if their top is winning hard, they won't lane swap, they won't use that momentum, they won't use that tempo regardless. I also think that, but Fnatic are not necessarily going to force them into a situation where they have to do that, because they're fixated on playing like this really, really limited kind of support pool. They're focused on making these level ones work, and then even beyond draft, like people are focusing a lot on draft, but I just think Fnatic came to the table this tournament. They're playing like they came to this tournament really unprepared, or really kind of like not sure how to execute even basic things like their game against EVOS. They had losing sides at a point, and then Caps obviously should be super far ahead in this type of matchup, but they force over really hard around Caps when they really don't need to. They really don't need to, because their composition is fine as the game progresses. They have the GP, they have Sivir, they have good collapse, and so they effectively end up giving like this game out to, in my opinion. So I think it was just really awkward to see this team play, and they just seem out of sync. Like even Broxa, who's getting a lot of praise, has had questionable early pass against TL. So for me, it just feels like a lot of this team is not firing in all cylinders unless they get like their god comp the way they did against Kingzone. I see them having a lot of trouble general, the best of 5 phase.
All right, so this is going to be difficult because I also picked RNG. If you read, I actually just released a preview on it. But I think, so the way that Fnatic can take advantage of RNG, I think we're really looking at RNG's early game, which I don't think, when I look at these two teams, I see RNG is still making similar mistakes to what we saw from them in the LPL and what we saw from them at the beginning of this tournament, despite the fact that they have adjusted a bit. I still think that their early laning assignments in particular are sometimes quite bad, and they don't have a good understanding of necessarily when they should swap early, which is funny because they suddenly have a significantly better understanding of this once they get into the mid game. But I do think a lot of their early decision making is pretty suspect in terms of who they're assigning to what lane, when to take turrets, that kind of stuff. And then additionally, when you're looking at the jungle matchup, I do still think MLXG is quite volatile, and that is a place where Fnatic should look to attack. Because if we saw in the Kingzone game, I believe MLXG still will make these decisions where, despite the fact that he either gets invaded upon early or he thinks he knows where Peanut is, he goes to invade at level 2, which is not new. Like, this is not surprising. It's not something shocking if you've watched MLXG, not even this year, but like any year. He goes to invade and he dies because he is 2 levels behind Peanut. And now this game, Kingzone actually lost because they were unable to transfer those advantages into like closing out the game. And RNG's mid-game setups and like 1-3-1 split is actually still quite good. But when I look at this team early, I'm looking at Xiaohu hasn't had the same kind of mid lane pressure that we expect from him, which means that MLXG gets punished a lot harder. So if Fnatic are still committed to playing around Caps, to having Caps push up the wave, then roam to side lanes and giving a lot of cover for Broxah, that's where I feel like this team has an opening against RNG. And they really need to focus on, again, like you talked about them getting their God comp, but I feel like that can be tweaked just to have pushing laning matchups and something for Caps where he can just push out the mid wave and roam and affect side lanes, because that's super important. That's actually a super important key to Fnatic's victory. And then I also feel that despite the fact that Fnatic have a lot of issues, right? Like I feel like they're still learning to play with Buipo. Broxah is still coming into his own, despite the fact that, again, he has received a lot of praise. I think he's had a very cool head under pressure, even when he's fallen behind. This is a team that, in my opinion, last year they were obviously like kind of this surprise, right? And they faced RNG in the semifinals, and it was kind of like, where did this team come from? They're still coming together. They have 2 rookies, and now this team has improved since then. And they also they're still trying to figure themselves out. Whereas I feel like RNG sometimes make the same mistakes over and over just because they've been together for that much longer. So I think that despite the fact that our Fnatic make more mistakes, I think that there are certain things that they could tweak going into this matchup that would specifically make them a good match against RNG, especially in the early game, because a lot of these early game things that RNG have been doing are not new whatsoever. And I haven't seen the team significantly improve over this tournament in trying to fix them. And I also am under the assumption that they're still going to be focusing on playing MLXG, although I'm not sure what they're going to do with their jungle matchup, just because they've seemed highly committed to MLXG, and due to his, like, I guess, pre-existing synergy with the team, his synergy with Xiaohu is always something that people really point out because they've played together for so long. And I think that he is still exploitable, especially with Xiaohu sometimes struggling early if he's focused.
Yeah, I think that just has more to do with people aren't used to like it getting focused in LPL. But I think It's interesting because I just want to clarify for people who are watching this and thinking, but Fnatic and RNG formed at the same time. Like if you think about Let Me, Xiaohu, MLXG, they've been playing forever, effectively. So if you just want to think about the core, then like RNG has basically been together long.
Yeah.
So,
sorry, I should have said that as well.
Yeah, no problem. Like the UZI Ming bot lane are sort of new, but those three together are similar. Have like a very strong. I think that if there's a win condition for Fnatic, it's through Xiaohu picking blinding Malzahar and Caps getting Corki, because they need an excuse to play that champion effectively is how I feel about it, because like Caps needs the champion that will have agency early and mid late, and if they pick Malzahar, that basically allows for Corki to have that kind of agency, also play extremely safe in lane. And then if we're in a position where like Hillsong is playing more Soraka and solo queue finally, so maybe they do end up prioritizing getting a better matchup for their bot lane. And if that's the case and they have pressure from mid, then I think that RNG will react very poorly to that. And like the only issue is that if it gets to a point where these teams are playing out mid late, I just think that Fnatic has throughout the entire regular season, if they aren't getting their level 1 off, they've really relied kind of on this like mid late collapse and outplaying the enemy team in those circumstances. They sometimes struggle to close, and they have gaps in that area, and that's where I just think RNG will kind of win on all cylinders unless Fnatic just snowball out of control. You know? So that's my big hesitation with this team. But I think that said, both of these matchups, the reason why I wanted to set this up is just you can legitimately argue.
Oh god,
that
they're the best matchups
really
we could have hoped
like,
for.
They're really
it's great.
Close.
I'm like really looking forward to both of these best of fives. I think they're both going to be really good.
And I think it's been a while since we've had and watched like them both go 3-0 now. But it's been a while, I think, since we've had. It just feels like there's no, oh well, this one is just definitely lopsided from the outside. So I'm looking forward to it, and I think these will be a fun time. I think that's it for me. But it's been a really fun group stage. I'm glad you guys have liked the show and stuff like this. So
sorry I was late. My internet was crapping out.